Duncan, let's bring you in from Glasgow. Great to have you here. Chief Resilience Officer for Glasgow. And again, somebody who's been involved with the 100 Resilient Cities. And of course, you were with COP, very much involved with COP and the global program around that. Welcome to program, welcome to panel. Feel free to share your thoughts with us, sir.
Sure. Thank you very much for inviting me, David. And hello to all my colleagues and peers from around the world. It's always a privilege to engage with you. And in many ways, I suppose that sets me up for a couple of comments about the fundamental importance, in my view, of an open, engaged and democratic conversation between people like us, but especially the politicians and people whom we serve in our cities, so that we can build that preparedness. And following up with what David and Karina have just said, build that sensitivity to the signals that we see, because any amount of information requires interpretation, and you need to see patterns emerging that could lead to disaster or could lead to long-term stresses on economy or society. So my first point is that we need to be in the room, physically sometimes, or digitally, as it is today, in order that we can then know who it is who's calling us on that red telephone when the emergency happens, or when a big stress occurs, such as COVID or a shock to our economy. My second point, which I think is really significant and went to the heart of our role as the host city for COP26, is that this is a distinctly urban agenda, and that our council leader, as host for COP, in 2021, often made the point that whilst nation states make pledges at places like COP, it is cities that are delivering on the promise of a net zero, climate resilient and socially just future. Every nation's targets towards net zero require their cities to deliver much earlier in terms of the target year. And that's no different for us here in Glasgow. The other thing I want to say, David, very much is that our focus in Glasgow, like many other cities around the world, and we're not going to claim Glasgow's unique, we can stand proxy for many of our peers on the call here today and around the world, is to try to bring together that perspective of the traditional emergency planning approach with our blue light services, scenario planning and risk registers, with that approach to longer term stresses on economy and society that was very much at the heart of our membership of the former Rockefeller Foundation 100 Resilient Cities Network. And that's very significant for a place like Glasgow, because we experienced a traumatic loss of jobs and meaning in the late 1970s onwards as we deindustrialized. And it took us a long time to recover, to become resilient to future stresses by altering our economy and by moving from being a post-industrial towards a post-carbon city. And in many ways, we want to ensure that as we do that, we can manage, to the best of our ability, a just transition, as it's called, for our people, businesses and communities as we move in that way. So my key point is that as we look at shocks and stresses to the system here in Glasgow as an urban ecosystem, vulnerability and social justice are at the heart of what we're doing. And in many ways, our perspective on resilience is that it grows from a more just and a fairer city, and one that's engaged as much as possible in democratic conversation. And as many of you on this call will know, there are worrying signs globally of trust eroding from urban and national governments. There are bad actors amongst nation states that are pushing that. And we need to be very mindful of what that could mean. If people don't trust the services that are there to serve them, then your ability to manage those stresses and shocks and a new pandemic or a new sudden shock are very much limited. My experience here in Glasgow very much, therefore, has been about what I sometimes describe as when it comes to climate change, hard hats and social policy. So we do need physical engineering. We need to send in bulldozers when it comes to climate change adaptation, recognizing there's now an inexorable and inevitable change to our local weather patterns brought on by global climate change, no matter how much we reduce our emissions. And at the same time, we need to do so in a way where we engage with our communities and ensure that they feel that this just transition is being delivered, not just for them, but with them. In the jargon of the time, co-created in many ways. And I think that's a key lesson for us here in Glasgow, that working with and for our communities is at the heart of a flourishing, just, and I think more resilient society. I'll just say a couple more things, David, about our reflections, especially from COVID, which really brought profoundly into focus some of the issues we already knew were becoming stressors on our people. The first is that 70% of us here in Glasgow live in flats. So very few of us had access to gardens or green space at a time when we were under instruction to stay at home and only go out very infrequently. And so the importance of public realm, of green space, of access to streets, of deprivileging the private motor car became all the more significant for us. The second thing, and a really profound point from our own blue light emergency services, is that their view is that your neighbour should be your first responder in an emergency before the 999 call or the 911 call, whatever, brings the blue light response. And so neighbourliness is an important asset that we need to build, grow and protect. But if people don't know their neighbours, or if they don't like their neighbours, or they fear their neighbours, then we're not going to be a more resilient city. And you can see in the United Kingdom at the moment some of the things going on in the streets of our towns that suggests there's a lot of work to be done there, a lot of rebuilding. And so neighbourliness comes out of that, what looked like a technical discussion about emergency planning with our blue light services as a key issue. And we return once more, therefore, to social vulnerability and to building greater social cohesion and social capital. And that's a significant issue for us, which I'll maybe come on to a bit more in the conversation. My final point is that, of course, no city in the world can stand against global changes of the sort that wrecked real challenges across Glasgow's economy back in the end of the 20th century. The key issue for us is whether we can, as it were, prevent those waves of history crashing against us and crest them instead as a city. And is at this point, David, that I can't resist just a quick quotation from Marx, who famously said that we make our own history, but not in circumstances of our choosing. And therein lies the challenge of the resilience agenda. I'll stop at that point, David. Thank you.
Thanks, Duncan. I mean, absolutely fascinating, all three speakers so far. I mean, if you're going to throw Marx at me, then I'm going to throw Ronald Reagan at you. And he very famously said that the most dangerous phrase in the English language was, "I'm from the government, I'm here to help you." And we do tend to think that, you said that, national policy is where it's at. We have, in the ISRM, we've very, very consciously kept away from national policy. I mean, I was speaking to people this week involved in national policy in the UK, who are nice people and I like them, but the idea that we can influence them has no meaning. Whereas cities you can influence, you can get in touch with the people, they can talk to you. They are doing stuff.